Welcome back to Uncolored. I'm Kevin Metcalf. What I'm going to do today is I'm just going to kind of summarize the last few episodes of this thing. And I'm going to talk about this moral relativism and kind of summation. I'm not done with it, but there's other things I'd like to get to. And really what I'm trying to do is give a broad sort of sketch of this big idea concept. And moral relativism fits into it this way. The first idea posits an objective reality and a creator of that objective reality, and understanding it in that context, in that frame, means that it's our job to understand what this objective reality is. Meaning, it's almost like if you go to a new city, you're visiting a new city, all of the objects are there, and now it's left to you to kind of discover where they are and how they all fit together. What moral relativism does is it removes an objective reality, and it posits a reality that's there for no particular reason, that came from nowhere, or at least nobody knows how it got there, and therefore posits creatures in this reality, namely us, who are somehow trying to figure out our way in a world that doesn't seem to be, or at least from a moral sense, follows these relativistic worlds where you can do what you want and I can do what I want, and neither of us should be able to criticize the other because everybody kind of makes up their own reality with regard to what's right and what's wrong. Now, that seems objectively false. That seems false. And again, it's not just my idea. And I've presented people like Joel Marx and other philosophers on one side, and then I had philosophers like Ruiz, who critiques that side, just to show that, again, this is not a new thing. This has been going on since the beginning of time. But what seems to be prevalent today is this idea that, there's your truth and my truth, and everybody gets to make up their own truth. But at the same time, we affirm, people are saying that, your reality is just as good as mine, except I'm going to force you to do my reality through government and other means. So this craziness that seems to come from the second idea, I believe, the only solution to it seems to be to understand reality as objective. So while many people say that reality or morality is a subjective thing, you do your thing and I do mine, nobody acts that way. And so I don't think that anybody really believes that moral relativism is the way to go. But I just wanted to summarize with William Lane Craig, who basically, listen, this guy, he's very good at the philosophy thing. And he makes it pretty clear using other atheist philosophers and sums it up way better than I could. So I'm just going to read a little bit, not as much as I did last time, hopefully. But, listen, more of them and less of me is always a better formula. So I'm going to start with William Lane Craig, where he talks about the problem and pretty much summarizes it. This is in his book, Reasonable Faith, the third edition. I got it on Kindle. I have all my books on, well, not all of them, but I get a lot of my books on Kindle, so it makes it easier to study that way. But he starts here and it says, if there is no God, then the basis for objective standards of right and wrong seems to have evaporated. All we're confronted with is, in John Paul Sartre's I don't know how to say that last name, the bare, valueless fact of existence. In other words, again, if there is no God, then we're just here. And there's really no point to any of it. We'll get into the idea of purpose later on. That'll be down the road. Because another problem with the second idea is it's impossible to instantiate ultimate purpose for us being here. It seems to devolve into this idea that we're just here to survive. If that's true, then there really is no room for morality at all. It's just whatever you can do to win, you should be able to do, if survival seems to be at the bottom level what we're supposed to be doing. He continues. Moral values are either just expressions of personal taste or the byproducts of sociobiological evolution and conditioning. Again, If there's no objective reality, then it's just kind of how you've been conditioned. And if that's the case, then there's really no way you can say that somebody else, the way they've been conditioned, is wrong. It's just different. In the words of in the words of one humanist philosopher, the moral principles that govern our behavior are rooted in habit and custom, feeling and fashion. This comes from a book, Paul Kurtz. He's the moralist philosopher. Forbidden Fruit, 1988. Craig continues, in a world without God, who's to say which actions are right and which are wrong? Who is to judge that the values of Adolf Hitler are inferior to those of a saint? The concept of morality loses all meaning in a universe without God. As one contemporary ethicist points out, to say that something is wrong because it's forbidden by God is perfectly understandable to anyone who believes in a law-giving God. But to say that something is wrong, even though no God exists to forbid it, is not understandable. So, the idea of right and wrong, if no God exists, it's not even a coherent thought, according to this philosopher, and I agree. The concept of a moral obligation is unintelligible apart from the idea of God. The words remain, but their meaning is gone. And that is from Richard Taylor again. In a world without a divine lawgiver, there can be no objective right and wrong, only our culturally and personally relative subjective judgments. This is Craig talking again. This means that it's impossible to condemn war, oppression, or crime as evil. Nor can one praise brotherhood or equality and love as good. For a universe without God, good and evil do not exist. There's only the bare, valueless fact of existence. And there's no one to say that you're right and I'm wrong. Now, I think that, again, in a broad sense, and there's far more detail that we can get into. Well, you could get into. I don't know that I can get much deeper than that. But that pretty much is it. There has to be some objective standard of what is right and what is wrong. And it cannot be human beings. Because then you have the problem of how do you know which human being is right and which human being is wrong? And you also have the problem of if we're doing X over here and we think it's great, and they're doing X over there, but they think it's horrible and they punish anybody who's doing X, then there's really no reason to say that they're right or they're wrong. You can just say they're not doing what we're doing. And that's the problem that I think people in the second idea come up with, are up against. And what we're going to find in what we're going to get to next week, and I'll get to that in a second, is one of the problems in the second idea. And again, this is the idea that posits that there is no God and that we're just kind of here. You have the problem of origins. This problem is in philosophy. It's in science. It's in all forms of life. And while we ignore it and we don't even think about it, I think most of us, and I think, unfortunately, in our institutions of learning, if that's what they are, that concept is pushed. Everything's relative. Whatever you want, you do. It doesn't work, and it doesn't seem there's a way that it can work. We're going to see the same thing when we're going to go into our next topic. And I guess this is a good time to get to that next topic. This is the area of science. Another area which I did very poorly in school. So the fact that I'm going to be talking about it is interesting in of itself. But before we get into the specifics, and we're getting into all kinds of areas, I wanted to talk about three ideas that seem to come up commonly that I just think, again, are just terrible ideas. And I know I started off with the idea that moral relativism might be the dumbest idea. There's a lot of ideas that they seem dumb on their face. I could be wrong because I'm not. I'm the least smartest person you'll probably ever meet. But as I look at it, I don't know how you get there. So the first idea is this idea that it's often posited as religion and science are in conflict, that they don't go together. Okay. In my opinion, religion is not a well-defined word. I think people don't understand that word properly, and that's something I'll get into down the road. So I'm going to substitute the idea of God. That there's I'll just say the first idea, that there's a creator of the universe. People say that it's inconsistent with science. And there's a whole bunch of literature that tries to make that point. Unfortunately, it seems that the historical fact is that nothing could be further from the truth. And it will be interesting to see why this other falsehood has come into play. It's a big myth, but you hear it all the time. Well, I shouldn't say you hear it all the time. If you look into these areas, you'll hear it come up all the time, that there are people who go, you can't believe in God and be a scientist. One of the idiots that says it all the time is that guy Dyson, Neil Dyson, the scientist guy. Tyson. Is it Tyson or Dyson? I don't know. Eric Dyson? No, that's another guy. Neil deGrasse Tyson, that's the guy. He says this all the time, and I'll play some of the things that he says. And again, clearly the guy is a brilliant man. But as I'm reading this, it just seems an idiotic claim that he makes. And he makes it a lot. But again, we'll get into that down the road. The second idea that I think is dumb is that there's this objection that you'll hear a lot of times, this God of the gaps objection. And the idea here is that, that as science has progressed, that scientists know more and more about how the physical world works, which I think is true. But then the extra step is taken that therefore, because scientists know more about the world, then that means God doesn't exist. And that doesn't seem to be quite a coherent idea. But what they'll say is that for people who believe in God, that the things that they know about, right, clearly it's science and whatever. And when they get to this area that they don't know about, that they say, well, God did it, right? And they say that that's the God of the gaps. Okay. Here's the problem with that. It's the same thing for those people who don't believe in God, right? The things that they know about, right? They say it's, a wonder of science and this is how it works. Fine. But the things that they don't know about, guess what they say? It must have evolved, or it was chance, or a random, random whatever. They have their own buzzwords that they fill into this area of ignorance that really have no meaning. They'll say it evolved or emerged or something like that. It's an emergent property. You hear that quite a bit. All that means is they don't know what the hell happened. And that's what they fill into the gaps that they don't know. But here's the problem. There's an even deeper problem. There's no such thing as anything of the gaps. Let me explain. If you're a person who subscribes to the first idea, you believe that God created everything. There's this God who created everything that exists. Okay. Well, in that case, the things that you understand, right? Magnetic fields, gravity, electrons, all that stuff. You think God did that. And the things that are quite outside of your knowledge right now, you think God did those things too. In other words, the things that you know, God did them. And the things that you don't know, God did those things too, because in your mind, God did everything. So there are no gaps. It's just, you know how God did some things, and you don't know how God did other things. And again, it's the same thing for the person who doesn't believe in God. If you start out with the presupposition that God can't be real, right? Both presuppositions, God is real, God is not real. You can't prove either one of them. I would say, and what I'm attempting to show, is that I think the evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of the probability that God is real. But we'll get to that. But either way, you start with one or the other. And if you start with the preposition or the idea that God isn't real, then guess what? The things that you know how they work, you don't think God had anything to do with them. And all of those things that you don't know how they work, you don't think God had anything to do with those either. So you fill it with evolution and chance and probability and emergent qualities. Those are the gaps that you don't know. So there are no gaps. God either did everything if you believe that God is real, and God had nothing to do with anything if you don't think God is real. Both are the same. But here's another problem with the whole God of the gaps thing. Let's assume that, well, I shouldn't assume. Let's posit this thing. You've got a dad, an uncle, or I don't know, somebody in your family. And they like to go in the garage on the weekends in their spare time and build stuff. They've got all these things. Maybe they're a woodworker or whatever it is. And as you go out in the garage, you see all of these things that this person has created. Well, there are probably some of those things where you go, oh, I know how he made that. And there are probably some things that you go, I have no clue how he put that together. But you don't conclude, because you know how this person made the thing, that suddenly there's nobody who made it. That seems to be a weird leap to make. And also, you don't conclude, because I don't know how it was made, that the person didn't make them. You conclude that because your dad or grandpa or whoever it is, because they're out in the garage building stuff, whatever's out there, they made it, whether you know how it was made or whether you don't. So the idea that because science has figured out a lot of stuff and some amazing things, that therefore God doesn't exist, it seems kind of like a big non sequitur. I don't know how you would draw that conclusion, because you know how some stuff works. Because at the very bottom of it, especially when you consider this, the idea of how it all got here in the first place, you can never answer in a second idea. I just don't think you can ever answer that question. It seems an even worse non sequitur. As a matter of fact, it doesn't even seem like a scientific proclamation. It seems it's more like a worldview, philosophical, illogical conclusion that you draw. So it just seems to me, and I'm going to help out all the smart people out there, you should stop using that God of the gaps thing. I think it's dumb. And I don't think it's a very intelligent thing to say. Because as I look at it, it makes no sense. Either way. You either think God did everything or you don't. And all your conclusions will come from that. So that's kind of a nonsense idea. And here's the third one. This is the idea of consensus. Okay, you hear about this a lot. And consensus, I think, is a very effective tool when you're trying to figure stuff out. Basically, what a consensus is that a number of people in a particular field of endeavor think that, let's say, X seems likely. And a lot of people seem to agree with that. That's fine. And it seems like if that's the case, then certainly you should give it its due regard. You should consider it, think about it, study it, whatever you got to do. But that doesn't mean if you have a smaller population of people in that same field of endeavor, know the same things you do, come to a different conclusion, that they should be excommunicated or attacked or kicked out of society because they're challenging the accepted idea. As a matter of fact, and I probably don't have to tell you, but we'll go through some examples. The whole history of science is replete with examples of people who had an idea that nobody believed, and it challenged the reigning theory. Turned out it was true. So this idea that because we have a consensus, therefore it's true, it's another dumb idea. And it's used more for, I shouldn't say that's not true. Well, I don't know that it's true. Maybe it is, but I wouldn't know. But it seems that oftentimes, instead of it being used as a tool with which to determine how you're going to direct your resources, it's used as a bullying tactic for people who are afraid of having their worldview challenged. And because they don't like their worldview challenged, and because they know that they're not going to get grant money if it turns out their idea isn't true, they attack another idea because it's not popular or because it challenges their worldview. But they do not attack it at all, or at least challenge it on the basis of data and evidence. And you're going to see a whole lot of that. Listen, the academic world is full of that nonsense, using consensus as a bullying tool for intellectual bigots. So those are the three ideas. The first one, that there's a conflict between science and the idea of God, that's nonsense. The charge that, there's this God of the gaps thing, again, just dumb. And this idea of consensus, it's a nice tool, but when people use it to attack people with whom they disagree, with whom, I don't know. It's another, I think, act of cowardice and ignorance, and it happens all the time. So those are some things that I just wanted to put out there before we get into some of the other topics that we're going to talk about. I'm not going to do any of them here because I don't want to go on too long. Nobody wants that. So that's that. We've ended the morality thing. It's got to be objective or it doesn't exist, and anything else seems to be nonsense. We covered some of the three goofy ass myths of science. The fact that there's some sort of a conflict between God and science. The God of the gaps idiotic claim, and this consensus, bullying tactic that's often used to push people out because people don't like their ideas challenged. Those are the things we're going to get into the next time. Again, I could be wrong. If you got any problems with anything I've said, please let me know, and I'll address them as best I can. So, thanks for tuning in to Uncolored. I'm Kevin Metcalf, and next week we'll get into the science thing. The book that I read from is Reasonable Faith. That's a book by Dr. William Lane Craig. Listen, whether you are into the first idea or second idea, the arguments are sorry about that. The arguments are solid. I don't care what you think about either idea. I challenge anybody to read this book, or at least look at the book and the arguments that William Lane Craig lays down. And if you can show me what he's missing, I would love to see it. I think this is solid stuff. Pick it up, read it. We'll be going through a lot of this, but there's a whole lot of other books that we'll be getting into, and I don't want to get into them now. All right, that's enough of me. I'll see you next time on Uncolored.